Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk, and I'm sad I can't be with you in person. So, I'm going to talk to you, as the speaker just said, about collaborating across disciplines, and mostly what I'm going to be doing is introducing the Shape ID toolkit. So next slide, please. So this is the outline of my presentation. I'm going to give you a rough idea of what the Shape ID project was. I'm going to talk a bit about definitions of interdisciplinarity, because that's quite a long-standing issue. There are lots of communities that use different terms, as I should go into. And then most of this talk is going to be about introducing the Shape ID toolkit. I'm going to give you an overview of the toolkit, and then I'm going to introduce some key resource collections that I think will be of interest to this audience. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So this is a really busy slide. Trying to compress a whole project into one slide is quite difficult sometimes. The Shape ID project was a coordination and support action funded by the European Commission. It finished in the autumn of 2021, and it had these kind of four main activities, work packages that you can see here. We did a big literature review and a survey of Horizon 2020 funded researchers working on interdisciplinary projects. We organised 6 learning case workshops, 3 in person and 3 online, because we were working, half the project took place during COVID. We created a validated knowledge framework, and then the final and most important output was, the most important output was a toolkit and an associated policy brief. And the toolkit mostly brings together resources created by other people, existing resources. We were very clear that we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. There was a lot of material already out there, and what we wanted to do was provide different groups of users a way to that material. Next slide, please. So to go to disciplines first, this is a kind of vexed subject. I've put up we argue, as a result of the literature review, that interdisciplinarity isn't often well defined. I've put up one of the most common definitions that appears from the National Academy of Sciences, and I want to highlight some of the complexities about it. So, the issue of whether interdisciplinary research is conducted by teams or individuals has already come up. It seems like a lot of your community is working in teams, but there is also a long tradition of interdisciplinary research done by individuals combining the insights from 2 different disciplines in their own research. Next slide, please. This is research that integrates information, data, techniques, tools, perspectives, concepts, etc., from 2 or more disciplines. And the integration, what that integration consists of, at what level and how you go about it is one of the kind of key. It's a key way of defining interdisciplinarity, but it's also a kind of key complexity. How do you achieve that integration? It's not always straightforward or obvious. Next slide, please. And finally, there's the fact that interdisciplinary research is often thought about as solving kind of key societal challenges, problems whose solutions are beyond the scope of a single discipline. But you can also do interdisciplinary research to advance fundamental understanding. So it has these dual functions in several aspects. Next slide, please. And LERU, the League of European Research Intensive Universities, wrote a report in 2016 called Interdisciplinarity in the 21st Century University, a very influential report. And this diagram comes from there. It's a way of understanding a kind of disciplinarity to transdisciplinarity as a spectrum, where disciplinarity is working within one approach, multidisciplinarity is working within parallel tracks, interdisciplinarity is working with some level of integration, and transdisciplinarity is going beyond that and including people outside of academia in the research. And this is quite a common, it's not the only way of understanding it, but it's one common model of the relationship between these different kinds of research. Next slide, please. And as you can see, the animation there highlights the processes that take place in multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, and transdisciplinarity, and they're thought of as different research processes. And the reference I put in the last slide to the article, colleagues and I in the Shape ID project have written an article in Science and Public Policy about this issue of definitions, and we argue that actually, rather than trying to produce one canonical definition of interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity, this multiplicity of definitions is a strength, but you need to be clear about which definition you're using in particular contexts. Next slide, please. And finally, on this definitional issue, there are a lot of other overlapping terms I'm sure you're familiar with, seeing as many of you seem to be doing this kind of collaborative research. But it's also talked about as co-production, as cross-boundary working, and sometimes as cross-institution working. And the one I wanted to highlight for this audience is team science, or the science of team science, which is a very influential approach in US biomedical research. And actually, we presented the Shape ID toolkit to the last Science of Team Science annual conference. And the Institute of Medicine has done quite a lot of work on developing team science methods and approaches to funding team science, as highlighted by this report here. Next slide, please. So now I want to talk about the Shape ID toolkit. Next slide. We had quite specific goals in mind. We wanted to, as I said, not reinvent the wheel, because we feel that this space has often been characterized by disparate groups relearning problems that others have encountered and found solutions for. So our kind of key goals were to inspire and motivate those who had not so far been involved in inter and transdisciplinary research, to inform and instruct a range of different users, and I'll talk about who those users are in a couple of slides, and to provide guidance and signposting, pointing people towards where they can find out more research. We had a specific focus on supporting the integration of arts, humanities, and social science in inter and transdisciplinary research in the Shape ID project. But I think, I'm not sure how relevant that is to this audience, but I think many of the materials are relevant across a much wider range of disciplines than that. Next slide, please. So, as I said, we provided a more targeted lens on arts, humanities, and social sciences disciplines. The thing that we didn't expect to do was provide bespoke materials for the toolkit. We provided a series of short guides and discussion tools that I'm going to introduce you to in later slides, because there was a demand for kind of short collections of practical wisdom that drew on the knowledge of the whole Shape ID team, who have a lot of experience in conducting inter and transdisciplinary research. People wanted our kind of collective wisdom in an accessible form, ours and others. And so we produced several of these short guides. And finally, we guided people to these resources. We guide them through the toolkit. We spent a lot of time trying to work out how to make this material accessible. I mean, particularly for those who are new to it, but also we wanted to make it accessible for those who are quite experienced and knew exactly what they wanted as well. Next slide, please. So it's a gateway to newer and existing resources. It's got guided pathways, including little clips and different entry points, depending on your role and your interests. and research strategies. And we tried to include a variety of resource formats, so it's not all just text. There's video and audio material as well. And finally, we wanted to make this thing last. We're still talking to the Commission about its permanent home, but we wanted something that would, we think we've created a good resource and other people seem to like it, and we want it to be an ongoing thing, not just another dead website. Next slide, please. So this is what the toolkit looks like. And that's the link if you want to go and have a look at it for yourself. Next slide, please. And these are I talked about different users. So we constructed this toolkit with 4 key groups of users in mind. Individuals doing research, those working for research organisations such as research managers, research funders and policymakers, because the 2 roles are often very overlapping, and what we called societal partners. We started off calling them research users, but then there was a lot of discussion about this term. It basically encompasses anyone outside of academia who might want to take part in research. And societal partners was the best term. I don't think, I mean, I know in biomedical research you talk about public-patient involvement, so that would be the kind of corollary term here. I don't think there's one ideal term for this, but in our case, our societal partners were business and enterprise, those working in the creative arts, citizens, and NGOs. But as I said, like the example, like I was saying about the focus on the arts, humanities, and social science in general, I think the resources are useful across other groups and other forms of research. Next slide, please. So the other way we structured the toolkit was by making it around a series of goals or tasks, kind of really quite concrete questions. What is inter and transdisciplinary research? Why would you do it? How to create collaborative conditions? How to co-create a research project? How to fund, support, and evaluate inter and transdisciplinary research? And we tried to do this so that it reflected the whole research process, starting with understanding and finishing with developing a career. So we hope this is a way in that people find useful. It's concrete, and you can go very fast to resources if you need to, or you can learn more about particular areas if you're unfamiliar with them. Next slide, please. There's also on the toolkit, we have we break down of the kinds of resources we offer. So the guided pathways I've already talked about, the top 10 tips, the case studies, and the downloadable guides are all the short guides that we created ourselves. And there's also an FAQ section that you can navigate the toolkit and some guided tours that we created. Next slide, please. So now I want to talk about a few of the key resource collections that I think will be interesting to this audience. So I've highlighted co-creating a research project, funding inter and transdisciplinary research, and supporting inter and transdisciplinary researchers. Next slide, please. So when you hit one of those green squares, you get a small snippet, and then when you hit on that, you get a page that looks like this for every goal. It tells you what we think co-creating a research project is. And then next slide, please. It gives you some resource highlights. Next slide, please. And then it gives you what our web developers called an accordion. I hope you can read this text. It's a series of topics. And when you hit on the cross, next slide, please, you get a small snippet and a direct link to the resource. In this case, it's a series of videos about why societal partners would want to take part in inter and transdisciplinary research. Next slide, please. And we've also written a reflective tool for people at the early stages of collaboration, which is just kind of a series of about 10, 15 questions that we think are useful to reflect on. We hope this could be used by individuals or groups at the beginning of a project. Next slide, please. And Christian Paul, who's an academic at ETH Zurich and has a lot of experience in transdisciplinary research, wrote one of our top 10 tips on working in multi-stakeholder collaborations, which covers things like really basic questions like, where do you meet? Don't always meet at the academic institute, go out and meet with your partners. Be careful about who of your partners takes parts in meetings. You know, don't assume spokespersons. Really, it's full of really wise advice. Next slide, please. Similarly, if we're talking about funding collaborative research projects, this is what the page looks like. Next slide, please. And this is the accordion. Next slide, please. And if you open it, this is about, I think it's about, oh yeah, it's about understanding the influence of funding on research and inter- and transdisciplinary research. We found it hard to find resources about issues, specific issues in funding, particularly things like budgeting, which is a real problem for inter- and transdisciplinary research. So I think this is a space where more work needs to be done. Next slide, please. We did produce some top 10 tips. Professor Catherine Lyle, who was one of the Shape ID partners and has worked in this area for a long time, produced a top 10 tips for developing inter- and transdisciplinary research funding programs. Next slide, please. And we produced a reflective tool for research funders. Key questions to think about around the phrasing of research programs, and who is involved in developing them. Again, quite practical things that we think are useful to consider at the beginning of developing a funding program. Next slide, please. And finally, we wanted to create some resources for those who support collaborative researchers, inter- and transdisciplinary researchers. And again, it's the same setup with the goals and the accordion. Next slide, please. And next slide. And this is about creating an IDTD curriculum CV, I think. Oh, it's about career pathways. Sorry, I don't know which accordion I highlighted for this. So it's the same structure where you go directly to a series of research resources with our little description. But one of the key resources we wrote, next slide please, was a kind of pack for research managers. And the title, you know, it's supporting the development of inter- and transdisciplinary research for the arts, humanities and social sciences. It was written by Darren Wallace, who was our amazing Shape ID project manager, and a colleague of hers also from Trinity. But I think, like the other resources, it is much wider application. It kind of gathers together what's in the toolkit and highlights how research managers can use this. And those are the resources I wanted to highlight. I hope you have a look at the toolkit and find it useful. There's an email address on the slides if you have any feedback that you want to send to us. And next slide, please. And that's me done. Thanks for listening to me. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Isabel. That's really interesting. Before we move on to questions, can I just say there are two ways of getting your question heard. One is by using the Slido app, which you've all used for the poll earlier. You can just type in questions there, and we might encourage you to do that throughout the conference. And also, you can just raise your hand, old-fashioned way, and make yourself seen and heard. Do we have a mic? Because I'm not sure Isabel will. Yeah, could you go to that table here, Rachel, please? Hands up. And so thank you very much, Isabel. And just to say, we have about 10 minutes or so for questions with Isabel right now. but we'll have a second opportunity to hear her comments in the overall Q&A session a little bit later. So even if you don't get your question answered right now, you have another shot.
Thanks, Isabel. Grace O'Malley from RCSI. I noticed that the project finished just in the middle of the pandemic. Or no, it was 2006. It was finishing up, I think, in the pandemic. And I'm just wondering, were there factors that you included in the toolkit for working in an offline world that you had to revisit and change, given that the pandemic had happened?
We were developing the toolkit during the pandemic. And we did, we as a team learned how to work during that. There is some material on kind of organizing digitally, particularly I think in the section on creating collaborative conditions and improving research skills. So, we learned that you can't organize a digital meeting in the same way that you can organize a face-to-face meeting, for example. So at the very beginning of lockdown, we organized a team project meeting in exactly the same format, a kind of all-day meeting as we'd had in person, and we were exhausted by the end of it. We realized that we had to change our ways of working. I'm not sure how much of that has made it into the resources yet. I think some of it has, but I think it's a really interesting point.
It's always going to be in a video call all day. Whilst you're all looking to put in your next question, can I just ask you, were there any areas that you would have liked to include but couldn't find any resources for?
Some, as I highlighted in the talk, some of the stuff around funding and particularly budgeting, it's one of those really, and the kind of institutional problems around conducting inter and transdisciplinary research, the really basic ones. If you share supervision of a PhD student, where does the money go, and how is the time allocated? We were also aware that the section we did on working with societal or the resources for societal partners were probably the least good bit of the toolkit. We're academics. We wrote as academics wanting to work with people outside of academia. If we were going to do another iteration of the toolkit, we would invite potential partners to tell us what that section needed to be, or not so much what could be done to improve that section.
A pitch here for our PPI Ignite network in Ireland, and this is kind of a national network in that space. There are a good few resources there that you might want to link to.
Yeah, it goes back again partly to terminology. So we talk about societal partners, and it's not always clear that the material that we're talking about is relevant to or material in PPI is relevant to the kind of other discussions around the role of societal partners. It is when you read it, but if you just look at the kind of descriptions and headlines, it feels sometimes like two separate communities talking about the same things.
Any burning questions? Otherwise, I might follow up there about just, so in some of the sections, I had a look at the toolkit recently, and in some sections there are quite a few resources. And how do you make a choice which one to use? You just have to go through them, and sometimes there are 8 or 10.
We picked the things that we thought, so in some sections, things like the case studies, they are all focused on the arts, humanities and social sciences, because that was our kind of the project's USP. In other cases, it was what was there. We tried to include mostly open access resources, because we don't want to assume that everyone using the toolkit has access to an institutional subscription. So we tried to make the majority of them open access. Some are, there's maybe a fifth of them aren't, something like that. So that was one of the decision-making things. And then we just took an editorial decision on whether we thought it was useful or not.
I just see a question here coming up, which I share as well. You touched on that briefly in your presentation. Is there a plan to sustain the Shape ID resource going forward? And how will this work if you've had kind of project type funding for it so far?
Yeah, well, we are talking to the Commission about its future. We would like we created this as part of a Commission funded project, and we would like them to take it up and use it as part of their funding process. So it's something that they directly point applicants towards. But we've got a meeting organised with them this month, middle of this month. The wheels of the Commission grind exceedingly slow. I've learnt. We had hoped to have some agreement with them so far, but it's partly a problem of project, the nature of project funding, where the funding finishes and there's no money to sustain a website like this that needs somebody looking after it on an ongoing basis.
I suppose it's the technical side of it, of hosting the website and making sure that the website itself doesn't fall over, and then there's also the updating with new resources and keeping improving it.
Still hosted by Trinity, and the website still works. But yeah, ideally there would have been somebody in the last 18 months adding content to it as new resources were produced, and that's been done occasionally. But it's a flaw in short-term funding.
Yes, indeed. Great. Thank you very much, Isabel, for this for the moment. And if you could all just say thank you to Isabel.